this huge wave of joy just came over me. It was like, I'd never experienced this kind of joy in my life. It was like the joy of the Lord had come upon me. About the time I was 3 years old or so, my mother got radically saved, and then my father, who is a prodigal, also got saved through an encounter with the Lord through a Jesus film. Years later, they were called to plant a church in Spain. My father had a visitation from the Lord, actually, and called him to go overseas and plant a church. So from 1989, when I was 9 years old, we moved over to Spain and lived there for 6 years. And a home fellowship group turned into a church. And then we were called to come back to the States, where my parents planted another church. But when we came back to the States, I was about 16 years old. And I just, through a series of experiences, I kind of hardened my heart towards God and became a prodigal. I just walked away at 16. Spent about 8 years pursuing things in the world. My God became money and success, and so I had an encounter one night in a nightclub in New York City, and it was a very large nightclub, multi-story, and stayed open all night. And I just remember I ended up wandering into a back room that I don't think I was supposed to be in. And the only way I know how to describe it is I feel like God removed the veil for a very brief period of time, maybe 30 seconds to a minute. And I was actually able to see things in the spirit. I began to see demons and demonic activity in people, which actually frightened me. So I actually ran out of that nightclub, and I reinitiated a conversation with my father, who encouraged me to read the Bible and the books of Psalms and Proverbs. So at that point I started seeking, and I started reading the Bible. So an inner conflict started to develop, and I realized that if the Bible was true, then my life was a mess. And so my father encouraged me to come home one Easter weekend, and so I did. And it was a Good Friday service they were having at church. So I snuck in the back, and I sat in the back row. And I can't remember what he was preaching on, but I do remember the encounter that I had at that service. And I remember weeping and crying. It was like genuine repentance had just happened, and I was just crying. And then this huge wave of joy just came over me. It was like, I'd never experienced this kind of joy in my life. It was like the joy of the Lord had come upon me. And in the middle of this encounter, I noticed my mother, who is sitting in the front row of the church, gets up and walks around back to me. And she takes a look at me and goes, "Wow," she goes, "your eyes have been transformed. They've physically changed." And she began to bring people from the church up to me to see my eyes. I guess they had changed. And that was 14 years ago. But I just want to encourage you that God is real. You know, I remember I had an encounter with a friend of mine that I used to do drugs with years later, and we were sitting together, and he was doing drugs, and he just looked at me and said, how do you not do this anymore? And I was able to just look at him and just say, I have no desire for that anymore, because, you know, I found God, and God is better.